Mark your calendar, true believers. Today is the day we hit 2,000 subs. Hopefully we can keep that 2,000 subs number. We assume that some of those are bots and they might bail on us. But for now, we accomplished the goal that we set out to accomplish 10 years ago. Now, I believe I promised I'd get a tattoo or eat a whole bunch of spicy food when I originally set out that this 2,000 sub goal was. I can't really afford a tattoo, and I think I'm a little old and wrinkled to be getting a tattoo at this point in time. Plus, you know, Jews don't get tattoos, the whole thing. As for eating spicy food, we could do that. I do like me some spicy food. But the big promise, of course, was an entire month without talking about Wizards of the Coast. And that will start February 1st. The entire month of February, my channel will be a Wizards of the Coast free zone, an island of tranquility amongst the Wizards of the Coast chaos. Which means, of course, Wizards of the Coast will be something incredibly dumb, and I won't be able to talk about it because I promised you guys. Besides, anything Wizards of the Coast does, everybody else will be talking about. So, instead, I'm just going to dedicate the entire month in February to doing whatever it is you guys want me to do, and revisiting some of the greats, doing some new things. Who knows? We're just going to take it we're just going to wing the 2,000 sub celebratory month as we begin the quest for 10,000 subs. I mean, it'll happen, but, you know, gotta have a dream, gotta have my meat iron mouse and 10,000 sub dream, right? Okay, so first things first, we have to revisit some of the classics. Oh, it's getting cold all of a sudden. We have to revisit some of the classics, right? Gotta go back to like some of the early videos, the most famous videos, the videos that got me the most love or the most hate. The first video, that's, you know, the one that started it all. So I want to go back to one of the very first, I don't know if this is the first video I did, but it's definitely the video that first got me attention from our good friend Condor DM. So if you go back, I know he claims we've only known each other for 3 years, but if you go back about till, you know, 2014, 2015, when I first started this, you can see the video I did, and you can see the multiple responses he made to it. So that video was, what is a dungeon? And why are my shoes always untied? What is a dungeon? And I'm happy to say the definition of what is a dungeon hasn't changed. But during my talk about what is a dungeon, I said something that, oh boy, Condor got so upset about. Apparently, because he knew more about D&D than I did, you know, his years of experience. So, see if you can guess which statement I made as I repeat myself. Oop, but first, gotta try the shoes. That was the one that pissed off our good friend Condor. Revisiting my very first, one of my very first, what is a dungeon? I hate to disappoint everybody, but sadly, real world D&D dungeons don't exist. And in fact, the definition for dungeon and the examples of dungeons in the real world pretty much are jails. Yeah, it's just, dungeons were basically a place you put people that were political prisoners or you just didn't know what to do with. They were basically a closet with a locked door somewhere in the building. As time progressed, these jails, they got a little bit more. Is there a bicycle behind me, or am I hearing a ghost? They got a little bit more bigger, you know, better than just a hole in the ground with a locked door. You know, we had lots of people we had to lock up, so we'd have multiple of these holes with doors that are locked on them, and they'd usually be someplace that was fortified, like a castle. You know, a lot of them are in Europe, but even the most famous ones, like the London dungeon, are basically just jails. They're just, doors with locks. So the imagery of D&D dungeons doesn't really match. And then when we got to America, for some reason we changed the name to jail. But let's face it, the jail in your local police station in the Tower of London and the oldest oubliette known are all just holes with doors that were locked that we put people in that we didn't want to deal with. Later on we would have, of course, we'd get torture chambers during the Inquisition and the witch hunts and just various wars. There was always a torture chamber or some other thing. Some of them were very elaborate, some of them not so much. But at the end of the day, most of them, jail. The closest thing in the real world to a Dungeons and Dragons jail are probably sewer systems. And even then, not really, but it is the closest thing we have to vast underground complexes, parking lots, underground malls. The other shoe's untied. Why does this happen? I swear it's a disease. Untied shoeism. There's no cure. The City of the Dead in France, with all those skulls and everything, that's probably the closest real world to a D&D fantastical dungeon. Some of the mazes in England, of course, the pyramids definitely evoke certain imagery, except of course when you look at the cross section of the actual pyramids and realize, it's only like 4 or 5 rooms and it's really not that impressive. I mean, it's impressive for the time, but it's not, vast Eldoreth complexes. So yeah. Now somehow all that translated to what we consider a dungeon today. The first, of course, being the Castle Greyhawk, which, started as a normal castle with a normal underground storage chamber and jail cells and what you would find in a normal castle, and then just grew and grew and grew. So now that we've got kind of this idea that real world dungeons, aren't as cool as fantasy dungeons, what defines a dungeon? Is it a dungeon because it's underground? Is that what defines it? Is it size? Is something about, X number of rooms makes it a dungeon? Is it the implied danger? Is it the fact that there are tricks and traps and monsters, and the dungeon is, as we've discussed before, its own entity with its own desires and goals? Because really, if you think about both from the fantasy point of view, our hobby point of view, and the real point of view, a dungeon is an enclosed space with some level of danger. Now, in fantasy, it could be a vast complex underneath the ground. In modern days, it could be a skyscraper or a battleship. In science fiction, it could be the Death Star. The Death Star could be considered a dungeon. In fact, going forward, we're going to use the Death Star as the example, because I think most of us know what the Death Star is, right? Or most of us know what Alcatraz is. We could use Alcatraz too, but I like the Death Star. Who doesn't like the Death Star? But basically, wipe away all the sci-fi trappings and what you have with the Death Star, Alcatraz, whatever, a shopping mall, is this place with very limited ability to get in and very limited ability to leave. And once you're inside, you're limited with what you can interact with. There's only so many things you can do in the Death Star. There's only so many things you can do in Alcatraz. There's only so many things you can do in the tunnels underneath France, right? You have all these options, but the options are limited. And there is enemies or things that might want to persuade you from not continuing on your mission. A mall might have security guards. The Death Star has stormtroopers. A dungeon might have undead. right? And these entities, usually there's a finite amount, right? There's not an infinite number of stormtroopers on the Death Star. They're finite. There's only a finite number of places you can put them. After a while, you'll run out. And there's just some places that don't make sense for those entities to be. Like the water room. Why would you have security guards inside the swimming pool, right? Now, of course, we are dealing with fantasy, and there are definitely examples of fantasy dungeons that have some ridiculous things in them, like a 15-foot shark in a 10-foot room, or 35 bugbears in a 15 by 15 room, and you're like, how? But that's because magic, and once we add magic into the formula, all logic's thrown out the window. Magic's the cheat code of the universe. But to get back to this finite construct, right? And once you enter the finite construct, there is a finite story the construct wants to tell, right? The Millennium Falcon lands in the Death Star. Go, right? Once the Millennium Falcon is in the Death Star, it is impeded. They can't escape. They have to go on this quest to find the MacGuffin to get the Millennium Falcon free. They also have to go on the other quest to find the other MacGuffin, which is the princess, and do their escort quest, right? So we know there's very limited ways they can enter, very limited ways they can leave, and very limited to the things that they can do once they are inside the Death Star. The Death Star fulfills all the qualifications for the dungeon. The Death Star has a story to tell. It has its goals. It has its individuals whose job it is to persuade you from not continuing. It is limited in the amount of ways you can leave it. It's limited in the amount of things you're going to encounter, and limited in the amount of things that do and do not make sense. And once you complete your mission in the dungeon, in the Death Star, in Alcatraz, in the shopping mall, in the tunnels, you leave. And because it is a finite story with a very finite goal and a finite list of things you can do, you don't really have to go back. There's no reason to return to the Death Star. Well, I mean, we blow it up at the end of the movie, but, you know, that's sort of finite. Most other dungeons, once you're done with them, they just kind of sit there and they're forgotten about. I guess you assume that either the villagers use the property for something, or eventually somebody else moves in, or it's just sort of hand wave. What happened to the temple? I don't know. You guys were done. It just sort of went away. Doesn't really matter, because the final aspect of what makes this a dungeon is you don't really have any reason to go back. It's told its story. Whether that story is Jailbreak, which would be the very first dungeon stories, Treasure Quest, get the MacGuffin out, Escort Quest, rescue someone, get someone out, Facilitate the Story Quest, go in the dungeon and stop something or retrieve something that facilitates the next part of the story. The dungeon has one goal. It has one story to tell. It has very few ways you can get into it, very few ways you can leave it, very few things that are going to happen within it, a finite number of things it can throw at you to prevent you from achieving your goal while helping it facilitate its goal. The dungeon doesn't want you to rescue the princess. The dungeon doesn't want the prisoners to escape, right? So that's the dungeon's goal, and everything the dungeon is doing is trying to facilitate its goal of preventing you from freeing the princess. Your goal, Luke and Han, is freeing the princess and getting out within the limited time span, right? But again, it's all about the limitations of the dungeon and the story you can tell within that enclosed space. You have total control over everything that's going to happen in that enclosed space. You have total control over where your characters are going to go. You know, the Death Star has total control over what Luke and Han and Chewie and the bots encounter out of its toolbox. But there's only so many things in that toolbox. And once it runs out of that toolbox, it's very unlikely that it's going to be able to refresh that toolbox quickly, right? You would need another shipment of guards to come in to replace all the guards that you've killed while you were exploring the caverns. You would need to hire more security guards in the mall to replace all the security guards that the characters get rid of. And obviously you would need another troop to bring in more stormtroopers, because you've run out of stormtroopers. Luke and Han and Chewie killed them all. That's probably not going to happen within the time frame of the dungeon. So again, finite number of resources, finite number of rewards, and then you leave. The dungeon story is done. That's the final part. You've painted your picture, you've told your dungeon story, it has nothing left to say. The characters move on to whatever is next. Now, maybe the dungeon helped facilitate whatever is next. Rescuing Leia from the Death Star facilitates the next part of the story. Could the story have continued without Leia? Probably. Could Leia have gotten out another way? Probably. Could other things that have happened, but you know, that is adding in the chaos of player characters and the weird things that they might do. But the story the Death Star wants to tell, rescue the princess. The story the prison wants to tell, rescue the prisoners. Telling that story facilitates the next part of the greater whatchamacallit. I have recovered the MacGuffin from the temple. Having the MacGuffin now allows me to facilitate the next part of the quest, where I have to go to another dungeon. Meanwhile, I don't really have any reason to return to the temple. Something might happen to it, something might not happen to it. Don't know, doesn't matter. Maybe it'll get blown up. It's told its story. So we go from jail, hole in the ground with door, to this idea of this large enclosed space that has a finite story to tell, and it is actively working against the player characters, often within a time frame. Those player characters are limited to how they can get in, how they can leave, and what's going to happen to them once they're inside. And then once it's over, they depart to the next story, and the dungeon, having done its job, for better or for worse, just sort of fades out. It's a tool you can maybe revisit later, or it's a tool that sits on your shelf to never be revisited again. That's up to you. But that, my humble viewers, was my take on what I think a dungeon is. It was my take in 2014, 2015, when I first started doing this in Site A, and it's still my take today. It hasn't really changed. I leave it to you to try and figure out which part of that was the one that began my multi-year long epic romance with Condor, because the guy's obviously obsessed with me. But yeah, that is revisiting one of the very first videos I ever did. I don't know if it's the first. I'm sure I did some before that. I know I did some videos of me eating ramen, and I know I did some videos talking about the playtest for D&D Next we were doing at Seth's Games Anime. Yes, thus proving I've been doing this for 10 years. You can just go back and look. And talking about the Freeport campaign. And I'm pretty sure we filmed the final battle of the Freeport campaign with the Lego ships. You don't believe me? That's on the Seth's Games and Anime website, which you can still find on Facebook if you look. Again, 10 years, sorry. There we go. 10 years ago, 2,000 subs later, 2,000 steps. Revisiting the very first video. Thank you to Robert McAllister for being my very first sub. Thank you to Matthew Bromand for giving me the idea. Thank you to Jeff's Gamebox for being my best employee this year and just being so awesome. And Wolf of Phototech for being so awesome and giving me so many great suggestions. And to each and every one of you, including the bots, who have contributed something positive to this 10-year-long quest. What are we going to do for the next 10 years? Well, I don't know. I mean, am I going to still be alive in 10 years? Is I still be doing YouTube in 10 years? I don't know. 2,000 was a lot of work. I don't know what I'm going to have to do to get 10,000, but I'm happy with 2001 as long as I don't lose them. That was always the goal, right? 2001, just one more than my friend. But I've still got plenty of stories, both old and new, to share. There's still some ideas rattling around in this brain. I've still got to figure out something we can do for February, since we're not going to complain about that company. I'm here for you guys. It's not 2,000 of me. I only have one puppet account. Unlike some people, it's 2,000 of you, or 1,000 of you and 1,000 bots. I don't know. But I appreciate you bot subscribers just as much as I appreciate my real life subscribers. Thank you. Thank you. All kidding aside, thank you guys for giving me a reason to do this every week. Couldn't make it without you. I want to thank everybody. Anyways, that's all I gotta say. Take care.